I'm David Jones. I'm going to be going over some PowerShell with WinPE and does anyone know what Polaris is? Yeah, I didn't expect you guys to do the PowerShell team. Polaris is a fairly lightweight PowerShell-based REST method, ability to create those. So I have that in here because I ran into a problem I wasn't expecting while trying to get this initial setup. So the problem that initiated this whole thing was, we have, for our server deployments, we didn't have MDT. The system they did have for deploying did not support UEFI natively. And so we couldn't use it for imaging. And so for the longest time, everyone's still been using, stick the CD in the machine and load the Windows. So I also wanted to make sure I had a PE image where I did not have to re-image it if the process changed. I didn't want to just create the ISO and be done with it. So the goal here for this presentation is to take while this was intended for both virtual or something where you can't lay down the OS from outside the machine, kind of like VMware, I'm still going to be doing it all with Hyper-V VMs. But the goal here was to build a Hyper-V server that's got a boot drive and a data drive, join it to the domain, and have it kick off a bootstrap. So it's going to actually, if we get that far, it'll actually go ahead and build another VM. So, oops, that was not right. Next slide. So here's the setup I've got. All right. So I got a domain controller, the certificate authority, a ProGet server where I can upload my my scripts and the modules. That's running under IIS. And so I'm using the certificate authority, so that's going to be HTTPS. So I've got to have my PE be able to trust the certificate. And then I've got my Polaris server, and it is running. It's there because PE, while it has the module in place for PowerShell Get, it doesn't actually have everything that's needed to make it work. So I needed a way to be able to find the location of my build script and the modules that I need without having to hard code that in my PE boot script. I also didn't want to have to, at one point I was actually using a redirector off of an IIS spot, saying, okay, you hit this, redirect, and it'll point to it. But every time I versioned the thing, I had to keep updating it. So I ended up creating a small Polaris thing to handle that. So let's go ahead and get started. So first, I needed to build the WinPE. So I'm going to create. I knew that was going to happen. It always works when you're first getting set up. Okay, is that readable? Does it need to be bigger? Okay, all right. Okay, so now normally most people, they're going to go through and they're going to highlight and run a line. And because of some certain issues here, it actually works more often when you do it that way, but there's a certain caveat I wanted to cover, so I'm going to run this as a separate script. So we're going to go through some of the code here. So basically, I'm going to create this temp PE folder. I'm going to be copying in the files here from the assessment and deployment kit that are needed for the WinPE. Darn hover. and we're going to get the boot WIM. Now, if you're not familiar with the PE, the boot WIM is basically the Windows image that loads into the RAM drive that you're actually running under. That comes up as your X drive. And I'm not too fond of having to press a key to get it to boot from the media, so I'm going to be using the no prompt, the EFISys. Okay. From there, we're just going to do a mount on the boot, and then we're going to add WMI.NET, scripting host, PowerShell, and since we're going to be dealing with images, we've got the DISM and some storage one. I'm not too sure if those bottom two are actually required for this. All right. Then, to get it so the WinPE image will trust the certificate when it goes to talk to the web server, I have to include the certificate into the image. So here I've got this huge byte array and the thumbprint of it. And I'm going to mount the registry off of the, out of the mounted WIM, and then I'm going to add these two registry keys. Now this is where I got stuck. This worked perfectly for dismounting and saving out the WIM after, when I ran it one line by line. But as soon as I ran it as a script, it blew up every time and left me with an orphaned mount point. It turns out that inside of a script, the new item when dealing with the registry PS drive doesn't close its file handle properly until the script ends. So I had to run the forcefully call that the close method and then run the garbage collector before I could unload the registry. And then part of WinPE is it runs a batch file called startnet. So I'm going to add an additional line in there to start up PowerShell and to run my PS1 file here that has a couple of functions. I got a right color here just because I want to highlight certain commands because the technician running it might not always know or might not just read everything, frankly. All right, so here I've got the git build script. We'll come back to that one. That's going to actually download and talk to Polaris and download the file. So I'm going to ask it. So I need to make sure my path includes the script's location. So if you've ever done the install script, it usually the first time on a machine is going to ask you to make sure to update the path. So I'm going to handle that, and then I'm going to get the this new branch server script off of my internal gallery. And as long as that works, from there, I'm just going to so if you notice, instead of using like a here string, I see a lot of people do that in the scripts they post online. I used a script block for the function I'm going to write to a file, because the set content, thanks to the way they are always changing how files work, it'll take a script block for the content, and it gives me the highlighting and whatnot. That doesn't run. So I'm going to go ahead and unmount it, and then we'll create an image. So right now, I do not have that folder here at all. Go ahead and get takes a little bit. So while that's running, let's see. Okay, so the git build script. What I'm going to do with this one is I need to be able to put together the request I'm going to send to the REST API. And I probably could have done it with invoke REST method, but the URI I'm familiar with, so that's what I did it with. So basically, I'm just going to take the output. I've got the output path here from the script name, and if they don't supply the path, I'm going to put that one together. And then the default URI is just going to be, this get package download, the script name. And if its repository is supplied, then I'll add that into it. So if you're familiar with the packages, NuGet packages are just a zip file with a certain file structure. So I'm going to unzip that, put it where it needs to go, and then we'll be able to run that. So let's see how this is coming along. Yeah, .NET always takes the longest to install. Well, I sure hope it didn't hang.
Famous last words.
Yeah, there she goes. Got all the packages, or all the cab files added here, and then certificate done. Just got to mount and save it. And we're done. So end result, I've got this folder, and I've got an ISO. So let's actually attach that. Power her on. This is probably going to fail. Just realized I didn't start the Polaris yet. Thought I'd save some time by going. So there, download failed because the Polaris service wasn't actually running. So let's get to that. Come on, type. Over. So here's my script for setting up Polaris. So it's going to, well, transcript log so I can help with debugging there. But we got to register the gallery that I'm going to be using. You know, galleries are per user configuration. So it does. So the service is going to be running under needs to have that preset up. So I'm going to import the Polaris module. I've got my new Polaris route where, so the path is get package download, like we saw before, and I'm going to set the my default responses of nothing found, and then grab these different query parameters. So I've got the repository name, throw an error if you're trying to give it both a script name and a module, because you can't do both at the same time. Then I'm going to take from my PS repository configuration, based on what repository name was handled to it, and get its either the script source or just the source location for my URL. And then I'm going to do a find module or script and grab the version number. And from there, I'm able to do a status code 303 and give it a location that is just the source location / package / package name version. So and then below that, it's going to create a scheduled task that runs this system at the startup of the system. So anytime this server gets rebooted, it'll just automatically restart the Polaris server. Now, I had to add, just because I'm on a laptop, the allow on battery, because that totally screwed up my thing. As soon as I unplugged the power, everything broke. So there is our task. Let's go ahead and get it started. So we're better. Okay, so I'm just going to reboot this. Okay, so this time it worked. Tells you how to start the new branch server. Actually, before I do that, I should just show you what I got here. I've got 2 disks. They're online. The only volume is the disk I'm on, so they're empty. All right, so it goes out and it's going to go get some additional functions, and then it's going to ask me some stuff. I'm going to get this kicked off, and then we're going to go back and look at the code on it. So I've got a thing in here for standardizing the computer names, so they have to put in some information. This is kind of made up, so this would be the sales at branch 120. Set the local admin password and password to a network account that can join it to the domain. And then off she goes. All right. So here's my my new branch server script. I've got a get required modules. Looks a lot like the one for function. Is going to query Polaris. It gets the redirect, downloads, and extracts it to the correct location. So I'm going to import those. That's where I'm querying the data. It checked the drive. Is the boot disk empty? If so, we're going to need this information and collect it. Then it's going to go in and is the data drive empty? So it looks for the largest disk, says there's nothing on it. So this is where the WindowsImageTools comes in. This module is something I built a couple of years ago. It was intended really for handling the fact that Server 2012 core didn't have most of the content in it, and if you applied any patches, you then couldn't use the ISO or the other WIM to reload any of the different features into the system. So that's kind of what got me started on messing with images. And so I ended up rewriting it to not just work with the WIMs and virtual drives, to actually work with physical drives here. So it's going to initialize the disk partition. I'm telling it I want a data layout, which just means one big partition, and I'm going to format it NTFS. And now that I've got some place I can write files, I'm going to grab off of the Polaris server, using the credentials I had previously given it. I'm going to grab my WIM file. This is just copied off of the CD at this point. I could just as easily use a custom image. And then, again, it's going to look, is the boot disk empty? Then I'm going to create an unattend. So for that, I need the local parameters, so just some basic stuff, the account to join, where I want to put it. And here's where the interesting part is. The first boot script is during, when Windows first goes and starts up that first time, it's checking all the hardware, figuring out what drivers and stuff it needs to do. You can run commands at that point. I think they call them synchronous commands in the XML. And from that, I'm going to put in a simple script that is going to create a scheduled task to run every time the machine boots up. And that's what I'm going to use to bootstrap. So that script can then check the status of each thing, restart it if necessary, and start back up, go back down its checklist, and when it's done, remove the scheduled task. So from there, I've created, just for kicks, I'm kicking out a couple of different unattends. And then here I've got the, wow, this is flying. I've got the parameters I'm going to use to actually populate the disk. So I got my source disk, the disk number I'm targeting, which will be, the boot disk of the drive. And then using the UEFI layout, because if you're familiar with disk imaging, there's the master boot record and the GPT partition. And when you're booting with UEFI, you've got to have some funky different partitions and stuff on it. So I'm going to have it automatically add these features. So I got Hyper-V, the PowerShell management, and SNMP, and remove the SMB1 protocol, which I'm not entirely sure is in the image that I'm using by default, but just want to make sure it's gone. And because those features are all present on the image I'm pulling, it's going to, I'm not going to give it a feature source to add anything else. I would have to do that if I was trying to add like .NET 3.5 from the beginning. And because I didn't specify, it's going to grab index number 1 out of the WIM file. So I've got the, I've also got a function here, because in our environment, if we were doing this on a physical machine, we might be using a lifecycle controller that provides a virtual disk that has all the drivers needed. So this is going to find those, and if they're there, it's going to include them as part of the installation. So, and then it splats all that to the install from WIM. And that is the huge center of a lot of the Windows image tools. So we'll see some of the verbose output of that in a minute. Then I create the file structure. I'm going to copy a few files. I've got my first boot script and the bootstrap that I'm going to inject in those. That I've got this other script that's actually going to create them. So that first boot script, all it's really doing is, because it's during that initial boot, the specialization phase, none of the services have started up. So I've got to start up the scheduling service, and then again do the fact I'm on a laptop. I had to do this with XML just so that I could turn on the battery function so the thing would actually start. And then because PowerShell functions don't work at this point in Windows lifespan. I'm just going to use the sketch task to load that. I'm also doing a quick disk part script to take the disk online, because the data disk, because it was built by another operating system than the one I'm just laying down, it's going to come up as a foreign disk and be offline. Oops, what did I just do? All right, so all right. Then it's going to do another one where it gets the build script. So we're going to go back out to Polaris and then over to the NuGet server and download that bootstrap file. So let's see where this is at. Looks like it's done. Oh, come on. There we go. Yeah, here's where the Windows Image Tools loaded. It detected it's on a PE and that the VHD commandments weren't available, so it's going to use a .NET class to handle some functionality. We're not really using the VHDs at this point, so that doesn't really matter. So it's going to create, here's the unattend I created for this OS, and then I threw a couple other ones out there for the file and print server and a client. And so here's it showing the parameters that were passed in to set this partition up. Everything we're going to put in there. And so it's going to initialize it as a GPT, create the EFI partition. That's FAT32. That's where the boot from file goes. The Microsoft reserved, and then of course the Windows partition with all the space. Now, is there anything missing from that list? You guys recognize? A lot of Microsoft's documentation for formatting the drives includes like recovery tools and recovery image, those partitions. They're not required, and my function, this function could do that if I specifically told it I wanted the recovery image done on my physical disk, so I can at least get to that. Half the time, if the machine's that pooched, you're starting over anyway. So I've chosen not to include those on this. So it's going to show me, I got an E drive with system, an F drive with basic. That's the Windows. And this is going to go ahead and lay it all down with the applying the image here. All right. Yeah, it's going to skip the source pass because I told it none. No source pass. Yep, here's where it's removing the feature. And then it's going to apply BCD boot and give me that's going to set up the UEFI boot space. So just so I don't mess with drive letters here, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Now in our environment, if we're doing this as a physical machine, we don't have a physical CD in it anymore. So the virtual thing that's mounted through like the lights out or the iDRAC is going to be disabled before we reboot. So I just don't want to confuse any of my scripts here. Any questions so far? I don't know. There's little bits and pieces I have to, problems I've ran into before. Like, I know Microsoft has their script for converting a WIM into VHD that they'd put out there for Nano and stuff, which is all, it was all in a script. And I was like, this would work a lot better as a module. Well, it turns out in the module scope, if you change drive letters or do anything like that, it's not visible to anything that outside of it unless you run a couple of things. It's actually a bug it was reported on Connect and then onto user voice. And I don't know if there's one out there yet on GitHub, but I don't know if it was designed that way or what, but it's one problem I ran into. So once this VM comes up, it is going to run this bootstrap. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I've got NuGet installed. So I'm going to look for the actual DLL, because if I try running the provider function, it's going to try to go out to the internet and reach for it. So I want to avoid that. So I'm going to check for the actual file it creates, and from that, register NuGet. And of course, the gallery for this domain. And update the scripts path. And so it's going to go through a lot of the same things here. It's going to look at, now first we got to take that disk. While the other thing should have brought it online, it didn't flag it for writable. So I have to make sure that that gets handled too, so that the foreign disk, it now becomes writable here. Normally I would also have it do Windows updates, and also it could do a driver package there if the drivers haven't been done. And so it's also going to check, do I have the WIM file on my data drive? If I don't have that, these other, a lot of these functions on here are part of another module I had put together just for our environment. So most of it's been sanitized so that I can publish it. So actually all the source code here I will get uploaded as soon as I've made sure I've removed anything that shouldn't be in there, so that you guys can take a look. I'm going to just set some basic Hyper-V settings and create a script. And from there, hopefully create a VHD in another VM. So this thing is definitely restarted. Okay, so where is that? See where it's at. Yep. No machine jet. So. All right. So let's see where it's at. A lot of the same stuff, going through, clearing the disk, setting the partitions, and looks like it is still on applying the WIM image for that VM. Now this is a little different because it's applying it into a VHD, so we, some of the sub-functions from what we're called are actually going to, they build the VHD, set its partitions, and then lay down the OS based on that. So we're waiting on that. All right. Is everyone familiar with the unattend? Yeah. XML is not fun. So, yeah, one of the WindowsImageTools function is a new unattended XML, and that will it doesn't do everything because there's a million things you can do in the unattend, but it takes care of a lot of the basics. In this particular case, we wanted to join the domain, so it leaves my super secret password out there. So we, not always the best, but I haven't had much experience or luck with the whole, creating an offline join and using that, which probably would be a little more secure in this, but it also requires you to have other stuff done in advance that maybe the technician doing it doesn't. But in our environment, if an unattend is found on a machine, it's immediately deleted by group policy anyway. So I've seen a lot of people with their examples for unattend. They say, like, take this and then do a find and replace if you're 32-bit or 64-bit. Well, it turns out they can live side by side. So in this case, it's a complete duplicate. One is the x86, and the other one's the 64. And the OS will just run whichever one it needs, except when you're dealing with tasks. So if I'm going to run a synchronous command, the 32-bit will run the 32-bit section. The 64-bit will run both the 32 and the 64-bit section, so everything will run twice. So since it doesn't actually trigger a 32 versus 64-bit process, it just runs whatever command it is, I only have to include those once. So here's where that first boot script is handled. Since I only asked for the path for that particular function, I've pre-populated the rest of this with the starting up PowerShell. And there's some parameters to set your own stuff if you wanted to create anything specific. It's different. It's just mostly right now it's just the basics, input locale, the items to make it so that it doesn't ask you for anything, keep it pretty clean. Here's where it set the password for the admin. So and that's still going. Well, anyway, so I'm hoping some of these things are the little gems in here that you guys might find useful for stuff that you might do with either imaging or just handling that first boot. I mean, being able to have something bootstrap and kick off right as the OS is coming up, I found fairly good. Now, I know there are ways to bootstrap DSC. I never had very much luck with it. A script usually works better, so this is a great way to have that bootstrap kick off a DSC config or some other automated process that you guys want to just not have to have someone do manually. So sucker's just churning along, isn't it? Doesn't look very busy. All right, well, has anyone got any questions or anything else? Yes?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the website, but if you Google it, there's a website to help you create the unattend XML, kind of slapping all those.
Oh, yeah.
And it'll just spit it out for you, and I use it for my physical blade stuff.
Yeah, the reason for the PowerShell one was just so that I could script the process. You can't script a website as easily. If they've got a nice REST method, that's great. But yeah, if you're trying to do something really complicated, something like that's probably covered every possible option. I don't see this going there. This is primarily just for getting the basics up, and then handling a lot of the other settings can be done after the fact. So. Yeah?
So after this image is applied, in your current tool set or solution right here, there's nothing to kick off or sort of like a post-imaging task sequence or anything like that. You're kind of just leaving that up to...
Well, the bootstrap could kick off anything from that. So after that scheduled task I'm building during the initial specialization phase, that could start anything. So that scheduled task then kicks off a PowerShell script and anything I need to do beyond that. I mean, this is a demo, so I was just doing something simple. I mean, it could do all sorts of stuff from software installations to, I don't know, configuration, registering it with your config stuff, getting its certificate, or anything like that. So, it's PowerShell. It's anything PowerShell can touch. We can manage it somehow. And while I did this with a Hyper-V, I could do the same thing with VMware. With Hyper-V, I would normally I'd use what I'm doing here inside this host. I would just go ahead and write out the VHD directly. Yes? Almost every script has a start transcript at the top. And in this case, just to be standardized, I've created this folder under the program data. And inside it, I've got one where I store my scripts and where I store my logs. So I just have a standardized way in which we have. These are where we're going to put any scripts that aren't grabbed off of our internal gallery, or here's a spot for the logs. I was actually looking at having certain steps in this is going to kick off an email over to our Teams channel. So that's working in that direction to have some sort of notification. But we don't really have a lot of sophistication in certain parts of our environment. So it would be possible to put whatever you want, to have it check in, let you know how things are going. I could just as easily do that with a Polaris thing where I have it write to a log, just go ahead and hit that endpoint, have it either shoot out an email, update a database, something, so that I can see the status of what things are at, how far they are,
We write our logs instead of going local. The first thing we do is we create a map to a central share. We're actually writing the logs directly on the central share. So
well, once this is on a domain, group policy is going to set off on that first boot up, and it's going to set our transcript log location and our log forwarding and everything. So we capture all the stuff that I'm pretty sure Lee talked about this morning. I didn't see his talk, but I've seen plenty of his other ones. So yeah, we're trying to capture everything we can. Oh, the scheduled tasks during the WinPE portion, something's not there. I can start the scheduled service, but the new scheduled tasks, PowerShell functions, just don't work at that point. But that's just because we're in that initialization phase. Who knows what's available? You have to kind of test it.
The scheduled task module is probably not available during that stage, right? That ships through the operating system.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things are missing in PE, but this is at the point, it's the full OS, it's booting up, but it's doing the specialization phase. Most of the services are not running. So I know the scheduled task was needed. I don't know why the other part is. It's probably top of your mind might not be running. I don't know.
Do you know what version ultimately of PowerShell gets run in the PE?
Don't know.
Depends on which ADK you use to build it.
This is the one I downloaded last month. So I suppose we can do that. We'll just bail this. Oh, come on.
Do you have any interest in having PowerShell core in WinPE?
Oh, of course. That way it'll actually have newer stuff. At least having something is a lot better, because otherwise you're stuck with whatever a vendor of your imaging tool or whatever you can manage to do with batch files. So that's the version.
It must be, I think ADK must be like pulling these caps in dynamically. When I go look at the one that's like sitting in the artifacts folder next to ADK, it's not 5 months.
I don't know. When you start the 80K, and then inside that, it's going to download the WIM and everything else, and you just go with whatever's there. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure how to tell it to refresh and get the new one. I just end up ripping the thing out and resetting it up. So, I mean, most of the time it works. I mean, like the Windows Update function I had in there, it was working great till November, and then something changed, and the image that is online now, it was using the same code you use for like Nano, and those don't work anymore. They do not work in Windows 10 in 2016. It's like, why'd they have to break that? So now I got to get a lot more creative with Windows Update. Anyway, that's all the time I've got, so thank you guys for coming.